Hello. Do you like stories? Stupid. Let's try that again. Do you like stories? I'll bet you do. I bet you know more stories than you think you do. And I bet you've been told stories and you've been telling stories your entire life. In fact, humans have been telling each other stories since the dawn of time, as we say. Some of our stories are so old that they have roots in prehistory. For instance, we know that the story Jack and the Beanstalk is really, really old. It's one of the oldest stories that has been continually told from ancient times up to this point. There's a reason for that. Maybe we'll go into that in another video. But what I thought it would be fun to do is to do a series of analyses of old stories, specifically fairy tales and things like that. Not just for the fun of it, but also to look at the deeper meaning of stories. And I'm coming at this from a Christian perspective because we say that the story of the Logos made flesh, the incarnate Word of God, Jesus Christ, is the story of stories. And it would make sense that if God had created all of the universe for the sake of his Son, Jesus Christ, for the sake of the universe, that he would imbue into creation itself, and especially into humanity, into our intellect, a seed of the knowledge of this most basic, most profound of archetypal stories. And so we're going to look at some of these stories, and we're going to look deeper at some of the archetypes, at some of the character tropes, at some of the profound symbolism that's in these stories. But most of all, we're going to look at the spiritual meaning of these stories. So the first story I'm going to look at is Sleeping Beauty. Most of us are familiar with the story of Sleeping Beauty, but the story that we know probably from the Disney movie or the Disney book goes back to an even older story, which is based on an even older story itself. And this is how storytelling works. So what we're going to do tonight is take a look at Sleeping Beauty, but more specifically, we're going to take a look at La Belle au Bois, Dormant, The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, by Charles Perrault. So we're going to begin that now. A series of images and some pre-recorded talk about that, and then I will be back. La Belle au Bois Dormant, or The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, was published by Charles Perrault in 1697. La Belle was one of the stories that made up Perrault's Histoire au Conte du Temps Passé, or stories from past times. Others include, and these are the English titles, Little Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, Puss in Boots, and Bluebeard. These stories were Perrault's versions of much older tales containing character tropes, symbols, metaphors, or metonymies as ancient, in some cases, as human storytelling itself. It was Perrault's versions of these stories that influenced the famous German versions published by the Grimm brothers more than a century later. Before continuing, it may be advantageous to define the word metonymy. A metonymy is a figure of speech in which an object, idea, or attribute of a greater thing is substituted for the thing itself, e.g., sleep for death in Sleeping Beauty. This is closely related to synecdoche, a literary device in which a part of a greater thing is made to represent the whole, e.g., throne for the office of king in the story Sleeping Beauty. I must also say that if you are interested in learning more about the use of metaphor and metonymy, the theme of sleep and death, the princess and the queen mother, etc., I highly suggest reading Sleeping Beauty Must Die, The Plots of Perrault's La Belle au Bois Dormant by Carolyn Fay, published in 2008. A link to the paper is in the description for this video. As familiar as I was with the story of Sleeping Beauty, it was my daughter's personal narration, accompanied by a dutiful displaying of the illustrations of Walt Disney's Sleeping Beauty. This is from the Disney's Wonderful World of Reading collection, published in 1974, that sparked my greater curiosity. As I write this, we are in the octave of Easter, and I have been preoccupied, intellectually and spiritually speaking, with the absolute primacy of Christ, the fall of man, and the victory of Christ over death and hell. Things like the incarnation, proto-evangelion, the Eucharistic anamnesis, katabasis, anabasis, anastasis, etc. Anyway, the illustrations in Sleeping Beauty jumped out at me, so to speak. The child is cursed by the jealous fairy. She is cursed to die, but the last of the good fairies tempers the curse so that the girl will only sleep for, quote-unquote, 100 years. The child, the girl, is humanity. Youngest of all because created on the sixth day. The evil, jealous fairy is, of course, Satan. She even becomes a great dragon at the end of the story. And Satan is both the serpent in Eden and the dragon of the apocalypse. The quote-unquote gift of the good fairy is to sleep and not die. And this is both a blessing and a curse. In this way, it mirrors God's gift curse of death. So death is both God's gift and God's curse. Death as a penalty for sin, but death as an antidote for sin. The prince is Christ, of course. Look, his sword is a cross stuck in the slain dragon. The sleeping inhabitants, including king, queen, and all down to the animals, are Adam and Eve and the prophets and the righteous in Sheol, and all creation awaiting redemption, subject to death, but not completely annihilated. There was even an illustration of a banner with a phoenix, the symbol of death and resurrection, on it, but I couldn't find an image of it online, and my daughter has already returned the book. The Disney book ends with Beauty waking up by virtue of the prince's kiss, and then a grand wedding is held. This is, of course, salvation history, culminating with the marriage supper of the Lamb. That was my idea in a nutshell, and I thought it would make an interesting presentation. So I read La Belle au Bois Dormant, which is not so neat and ends with a much different story than the Sleeping Beauty that most of us are accustomed to. So what about La Belle au Bois Dormant?
Bonsoir, c'est Belle. What follows my own reading of La Belle au Bois Dormant, The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood by Charles Perrault. This reading, if I'm correct, takes about 21 minutes and 22 seconds. So if you want to skip ahead when I'm done talking, you can do that. If you're watching this as a premiere, you can't. I apologize, but you need to know the story in order to, if you want to follow along with my analysis, if you want to follow along with me. So if you don't want to listen to my reading of it, what I would invite you to do, skip ahead and pause. You can find a free PDF of the story online if you just do a search for La Belle au Bois Dormant by Charles Perrault in English. And I would read that first. If I remember, I'll put a link in the description to the page so you can go read that, or you can read along while you're listening to my soothing voice. So, that being said, I'll catch you on the flip. Ciao.
The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood by Charles Perrault. Once upon a time there lived a king and a queen who were grieved, more grieved than words can tell, because they had no children. They tried the waters of every country, made vows and pilgrimages, and did everything that could be done, but without result. At last, however, the queen found that her wishes were fulfilled, and in due course she gave birth to a daughter. A grand christening was held, and all the fairies that could be found in the realm, they numbered 7 in all, were invited to be godmothers to the little princess. This was done so that by means of the gifts which each in turn would bestow upon her, in accordance with the fairy custom of those days, the princess might be endowed with every imaginable perfection. When the christening ceremony was over, all the company returned to the king's palace, where a great banquet was held in honor of the fairies. Places were laid for them in magnificent style, and before each was placed a solid gold casket containing a spoon, fork, and knife of fine gold, set with diamonds and rubies. But just as all were sitting down to table, an aged fairy was seen to enter, whom no one had thought to invite, the reason being that for more than 50 years she had never quitted the tower in which she lived, and people had supposed her to be dead or bewitched. By the king's orders, a place was laid for her, but it was impossible to give her a golden casket like the others, for only 7 had been made for the 7 fairies. The old creature believed that she was intentionally slighted and muttered threats between her teeth. She was overheard by one of the young fairies who was seated nearby. The latter, guessing that some mischievous gift might be bestowed upon the little princess, hid behind the tapestry as soon as the company left the table. Her intention was to be the last to speak, and so to have the power of counteracting, as far as possible, any evil which the old fairy might do. Presently the fairies began to bestow their gifts upon the princess. The youngest ordained that she should be the most beautiful person in the world. The next, that she should have the temper of an angel. The third, that she should do everything with wonderful grace. The fourth, that she should dance to perfection. The fifth, that she should sing like a nightingale. And the sixth, that she should play every kind of music with the utmost skill. It was now the turn of the aged fairy. Shaking her head in token of spite rather than of infirmity, she declared that the princess should prick her hand with a spindle and die of it. A shudder ran through the company at this terrible gift. All eyes were filled with tears. But at this moment the young fairy stepped forth from behind the tapestry. "Take comfort, your majesties," she cried in a loud voice. "Your daughter shall not die. My power, it is true, is not enough to undo all that my aged kinswoman has decreed. The princess will indeed prick her hand with a spindle, but instead of dying, she shall merely fall into a profound slumber that will last 100 years. At the end of that time, a king's son shall come to awaken her." The king, in an attempt to avert the unhappy doom pronounced by the old fairy, at once published an edict forbidding all persons, under pain of death, to use a spinning wheel or keep a spindle in the house. At the end of 15 or 16 years, the king and queen happened one day to be away, on pleasure bent. The princess was running about the castle, and going upstairs from room to room, she came at length to a garret at the top of a tower, where an old serving woman sat alone with her distaff, spinning. This good woman had never heard speak of the king's proclamation forbidding the use of spinning wheels. "What are you doing, my good woman?" asked the princess. "I am spinning, my pretty child," replied the dame, not knowing who she was. "Oh, what fun!" rejoined the princess. "How do you do it? Let me try and see if I can do it equally well." Partly because she was too hasty, partly because she was a little heedless, but also because the fairy decree had ordained it, no sooner had she seized the spindle than she pricked her hand and fell down in a swoon. In great alarm, the good dame cried out for help. People came running from every quarter to the princess. They threw water on her face, chafed her with their hands, and rubbed her temples with the royal essence of Hungary, but nothing would restore her. Then the king, who had been brought upstairs by the commotion, remembered the fairy prophecy. Feeling certain that what had happened was inevitable, since the fairies had decreed it, he gave orders that the princess should be placed in the finest apartment in the palace, upon a bed embroidered in gold and silver. You would have thought her an angel, so fair was she to behold. The trance had not taken away the lovely color of her complexion. Her cheeks were delicately flushed, her lips like coral. Her eyes, indeed, were closed, but her gentle breathing could be heard. And it was plain, therefore, that she was not dead. The king commanded that she should be left to sleep in peace until the hour of her awakening should come. When the accident happened to the princess, the good fairy who had saved her life by condemning her to sleep 100 years was in the kingdom of Mataquin, 12,000 leagues away. She was instantly warned of it, however, by a little dwarf who had a pair of 7-league boots, which are boots that enable one to cover 7 leagues at a single step. The fairy set off at once, and within an hour her chariot of fire, drawn by dragons, was seen approaching. The king handed her down from her chariot, and she approved of all that he had done. But being gifted with great powers of foresight, she bethought herself that when the princess came to be awakened, she would be much distressed to find herself all alone in the old castle. And this is what she did. She touched with her wand everybody except the king and queen who was in the castle. Governesses, maids of honor, ladies in waiting, gentlemen, officers, stewards, cooks, scullions, errand boys, guards, porters, pages, footmen. She touched likewise all the horses in the stables with their grooms, the big mastiffs in the courtyard, and little Puff, the pet dog of the princess, who was lying on the bed beside his mistress. The moment she had touched them, they all fell asleep, to awaken only at the same moment as their mistress. Thus they would always be ready with their service whenever she should require it. The very spits before the fire, loaded with partridges and pheasants, subsided into slumber, and the fire as well. All was done in a moment, for the fairies do not take long over their work. Then the king and queen kissed their dear child, without waking her, and left the castle. Proclamations were issued forbidding any approach to it, but these warnings were not heeded, for within a quarter of an hour there grew up all around the park so vast a quantity of trees, big and small, with interlacing brambles and thorns that neither man nor beast could penetrate them. The tops alone of the castle towers could be seen, and these only from a distance. Thus did the fairies' magic contrive that the princess, during all the time of her slumber, should have naught whatever to fear from prying eyes. At the end of 100 years, the throne had passed to another family from that of the sleeping princess. One day the king's son chanced to go a-hunting that way, and seeing in the distance some towers in the midst of a large and dense forest, he asked what they were. His attendants told him in reply the various stories which they had heard. Some said there was an old castle haunted by ghosts, others that all the witches of the neighborhood held their revels there. The favorite tale was that in the castle lived an ogre, who carried thither all the children whom he could catch. There he devoured them at his leisure, and since he was the only person who could force a passage through the wood, nobody had been able to pursue him. While the prince was wondering what to believe, an old peasant took up the tale. "Your Highness," said he, "more than 50 years ago I heard my father say that in this castle lies a princess, the most beautiful that has ever been seen. It is her doom to sleep there for 100 years, and then to be awakened by a king's son, for whose coming she waits." This story fired the young prince. He jumped immediately to the conclusion that it was for him to see so gay an adventure through, and impelled alike by the wish for love and glory, he resolved to set about it on the spot. Hardly had he taken a step towards the wood when the tall trees, the brambles, and the thorns separated of themselves and made a path for him. He turned in the direction of the castle and espied it at the end of a long avenue. This avenue he entered, and was surprised to notice that the trees closed up again as soon as he had passed, so that none of his retinue were able to follow him. A young and gallant prince is always brave, however, so he continued on his way, and presently reached a large forecourt. The sight that now met his gaze was enough to fill him with an icy fear. The silence of the place was dreadful, and death seemed all about him. The recumbent figures of men and animals had all the appearance of being lifeless, until he perceived by the pimply noses and ruddy faces of the porters that they merely slept. It was plain, too, from their glasses, in which were still some dregs of wine, that they had fallen asleep while drinking. The prince made his way into a great courtyard paved with marble, and mounting the staircase, entered the guard-room. Here the guards were lined up on either side in 2 ranks, their muskets on their shoulders, snoring their hardest. Through several apartments crowded with ladies and gentlemen in waiting, some seated, some standing, but all asleep, he pushed on, and so came at last to a chamber which was decked all over with gold. There he encountered the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. Reclining upon a bed, the curtains of which on every side were drawn back, was the princess of some seemingly 15 or 16 summers, whose radiant beauty had an almost unearthly luster. Trembling in his admiration, he drew near and went on his knees beside her. At the same moment, the hour of disenchantment having come, the princess awoke. and bestowed upon him a look more tender than a first glance might seem to warrant. "Is it you, dear prince?" she said. "You have been long in coming." Charmed by these words, and especially by the manner in which they were said, the prince scarcely knew how to express his delight and gratification. He declared that he loved her better than he loved himself. His words were faltering, but they pleased the more for that. The less there is of eloquence, the more there is of love. Her embarrassment was less than his, and that is not to be wondered at, since she had time to think of what she would say to him. It seems, although the story says nothing about it, that the good fairy had beguiled her long slumber with pleasant dreams. To be brief, after 4 hours of talking, they had not succeeded in uttering one half of the things they had to say to each other. Now the whole palace had awakened with the princess. Everyone went about his business, and since they were not all in love, they presently began to feel mortally hungry. The lady-in-waiting, who was suffering like the rest, at length lost patience, and in a loud voice called out to the princess that supper was served. The princess was already fully dressed and in most magnificent style. As he helped her to rise, the prince refrained from telling her that her clothes, with the straight collar which she wore, were like those to which his grandmother had been accustomed, and in truth they in no way detracted from her beauty. They passed into an apartment hung with mirrors, and were there served with supper by the stewards of the household, while the fiddles and oboes played some old music and played it remarkably well, considering they had not played at all for just upon 100 years. A little later, when supper was over, the chaplain married them in the castle chapel, and in due course, attended by the courtiers in waiting, they retired to rest. They slept but little, however. The princess indeed had not much need of sleep, and as soon as morning came, the prince took his leave of her. He returned to the city and told his father, who was waiting upon him with some anxiety, that he had lost himself while hunting in the forest, but had obtained some black bread and cheese from a charcoal burner, in whose hovel he had passed the night. His royal father, being of an easygoing nature, believed the tale, but his mother was not so easily hoodwinked. She noticed that he now went hunting every day, and that he always had an excuse handy when he had slept 2 or 3 nights from home. She felt certain, therefore, that he had some love affair. 2 whole years passed since the marriage of the prince and princess, and during that time they had 2 children. The first, a daughter, was called Dawn, while the second, a boy, was named Day, because he seemed even more beautiful than his sister. Many a time the queen told her son that he ought to settle down in life. She tried in this way to make him confide in her, but he did not dare to trust her with his secret. Despite the affection which he bore her, he was afraid of his mother, for she came of a race of ogres, and the king had only married her for her wealth. It was whispered at the court that she had ogrish instincts, and that when little children were near her, she had the greatest difficulty in the world to keep herself from pouncing on them. No wonder the prince was reluctant to say a word. But at the end of 2 years, the king died, and the prince found himself on the throne. He then made public announcement of his marriage, and went in state to fetch his royal consort from her castle. With her 2 children beside her, she made a triumphal entry into the capital of her husband's realm. Some time afterwards, the king declared war on his neighbor, the Emperor Cantalbut. He appointed the queen mother as regent in his absence, and entrusted his wife and children to her care. He expected to be away at the war for the whole of the summer, and as soon as he was gone, the queen mother sent her daughter-in-law and the 2 children to a country mansion in the forest. This she did that she might be able the more easily to gratify her horrible longings. A few days later she went there, and in the evening summoned the chief steward. "For my dinner tomorrow," she told him, "I will eat little Dawn." "Oh, madam," exclaimed the steward. "That is my will," said the queen, and she spoke in the tones of an ogre who longs for raw meat. "You will serve her with piquant sauce," she added. The poor man, seeing plainly that it was useless to trifle with an ogress, took his big knife and went up to little Dawn's chamber. She was at that time 4 years old, and when she came running with a smile to greet him, flinging her arms round his neck and coaxing him to give her some sweets, he burst into tears and let the knife fall from his hand. Presently he went down to the yard behind the house and slaughtered a young lamb. For this he made so delicious a sauce that his mistress declared she had never eaten anything so good. At the same time the steward carried little Dawn to his wife and bade the latter hide her in the quarters which they had below the yard. 8 days later the wicked queen summoned her steward again. "For my supper," she announced, "I will eat little Day." The steward made no answer, being determined to trick her as he had done previously. He went in search of little Day, whom he found with a tiny foil in his hand, making brave passes, though he was but 3 years old, at a big monkey. He carried him off to his wife, who stowed him away in hiding with little Dawn. To the ogress the steward served up, in place of Day, a young kid so tender that she found it surpassingly delicious. So far, so good. But there came an evening when this evil queen again addressed the steward. "I have a mind," she said, "to eat the queen with the same sauce as you served with her children." This time the poor steward despaired of being able to practice another deception. The young queen was 20 years old without counting the 100 years she had been asleep. Her skin, though white and beautiful, had become a little tough, and what animal could he possibly find that would correspond to her? He made up his mind that if he would save his own life, he must kill the queen, and went upstairs to her apartment, determined to do the deed once and for all. Goading himself into a rage, he drew his knife and entered the young queen's chamber. But a reluctance to give her no moment of grace made him repeat respectfully the command which he had received from the queen mother. Do it, she cried, baring her neck to him. "Carry out the order you have been given. Then once more I shall see my children, my poor children that I loved so much." Nothing had been said to her when the children were stolen away, and she believed them to be dead. The poor steward was overcome by compassion. No, madam," he declared, "you shall not die, but you shall certainly see your children again. That will be in my quarters, where I have hidden them. I shall make the queen eat a young hind in place of you, and thus trick her once more." Without more ado, he led her to his quarters, and leaving her there to embrace and weep over her children, proceeded to cook a hind with such art that the queen mother ate it for her supper with as much appetite as if it had indeed been the young queen. The queen mother felt well satisfied with her cruel deeds and planned to tell the king, on his return, that savage wolves had devoured his consort and his children. It was her habit, however, to prowl often about the courts and alleys of the mansion in the hope of scenting raw meat, and one evening she heard the little boy Day crying in a basement cellar. The child was weeping because his mother had threatened to whip him for some naughtiness, and she heard at the same time the voice of Dawn begging forgiveness for her brother. The ogress recognized the voices of the queen and her children, and was enraged to find she had been tricked. The next morning, in tones so affrighting that all trembled, she ordered a huge vat to be brought into the middle of the courtyard. This she filled with vipers and toads, with snakes and serpents of every kind, intending to cast into it the queen and her children, and the steward with his wife and serving girl. By her command, these were brought forward with their hands tied behind their backs. There they were, and her minions were making ready to cast them into the vat, when into the courtyard rode the king. Nobody had expected him so soon, but he had traveled post-haste. Filled with amazement, he demanded to know what this horrible spectacle meant. None dared tell him, and at that moment the ogress, enraged at what confronted her, threw herself head foremost into the vat, and was devoured on the instant by the hideous creature she had placed in it. The king could not but be sorry, for after all she was his mother, but it was not long before he found ample consolation in his beautiful wife and children. The moral of the story. Many a girl has waited long for a husband brave or strong, but I'm sure I never met any sort of woman yet who could wait 100 years, free from fretting, free from fears. Now our story seems to show that a century or so, late or early matters not, true love comes by fairy lot. Some old folk will even say, it grows better by delay. Yet this good advice, I fear, helps us neither there nor here. Though philosophers may prate how much wiser 'tis to wait, Maids will be a sighing still. Young blood must when young blood will. The end.
All right, let's take a look at La Belle au Bois Dormant. So I will share my screen. Take a look at The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood by Charles Perrault. So we just listened to the story itself. We'll go through here and take a look at some things in the story I think are very interesting. And I'm not sure how we'll dwell on this, but so let's start at the beginning. Once upon a time. So every good story should begin once upon a time. And there's a king and a queen who were grieved, more grieved than words can tell, because they had no children. So you have this this standard trope of the childless couple. Of course, from scripture, we know with Abraham and Sarah, with Zechariah and Elizabeth, that the childless couple is a common trope, and they're searching for God to provide them this child. And the child that God provides is often a child of promise, or brings about, is a great portent, either as a forerunner like John the Baptist, or as the child of promise, like Isaac. So with this here, it says they tried the waters of every country, made vows and pilgrimages, and did everything that could be done, but without result. At last, however, the queen found that her wishes were fulfilled, and in due course she gave birth to a daughter. So we'll see in this sentence and in the following sentences is you have a very obvious Christian element here. This couple, this king and queen, they're making vows. You make a vow to God. You make an oath to another person. You make a vow to God in the presence of people. They took pilgrimages. They did everything they could. So they displayed faith. But the funny thing is, it says without results. And then the next line is the wishes were fulfilled. It's a curious line because they did get results, just not in the hour, in the way that they expected. So a child's born, and there's a grand christening was held, and all the fairies that could be found in the realm, 7 in all, were invited to be godmothers to the little princess. I took some notes down here, and I thought it was interesting that in this story, so as I referenced earlier in the video, this version of Sleeping Beauty by Perrault is based. It is based, but it's based in part on older stories. There's a story from the 14th century, or a series of stories from the 14th century, I believe, entitled Persephorist, which I don't have time to go into that in total, but in that story features 3 fates, three goddesses, which I'll get into in a moment. And that's more likened to the 20th century Disney version, where you have the 3 godmothers. But here there are 3 fairies. Firstly, the child's christened, so the child is baptized, and these fairies are invited to be godmothers. 7 godmothers to this princess. What is interesting is that in this story, so in this world, so this is and is not what we would call the real world. It's real, but it is and is not the world of history. This is a fairy tale world. This is a world that has material and spirit, and operates according to the rules of a fairy tale. In this one, there is no enmity between Christianity and natural religions, or we could say paganism. There's a synthesis here. So we know as Christians moved into Europe, and as the barbarians were baptized and Christianized, Christians began to gain hegemony over the pagans, and would adopt pagan elements, pagan symbols, and bring them into the Christian religion. Here we have fairies consenting to be godmothers at a baptism, which then raises the question: how do the fairies relate to the Christian God? How do they relate to Jesus Christ? Of course, this is a fairy tale, so that's not the point of it. But nowadays we tend to think of, and I think this is not necessarily a good thing, but we tend to think of of the Christian stories and fairy tales and those kind of things as being antithetical. That's not necessarily so. So there is no enmity between the natural religion and the supernatural religion. Now, in this story, you have 7 godmothers. So, in a Christian context, baptism, and you have Christian king and queen. 7 is an important number in Judaism and in Christianity. And immediately you think of the 7 sacraments, but also you think of the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. And in the next line here, it says, this was done so that by means of the gifts which each in turn would bestow upon her, in accordance with the fairy custom of those days, the princess might be endowed with every imaginable perfection. So right there, Perrault is saying these 7 godmothers are going to give 7 gifts. So you could say, I think without doing harm to the story, that these fairies, in a way, personify in their 7-fold persons, personify the one divine person of the Holy Spirit, or at least represent the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And I'll get into that more. So they're invited to give these child gifts, and they bestow blessings upon the child. When the ceremony was over, they returned to the king's palace, where a great banquet was held in honor of the fairies. Places were laid for them in magnificent style, and before each was placed a solid gold casket, containing a spoon, fork, and a knife of fine gold, set with diamonds and rubies. So here, very interesting that the fairies are gifted with implements that you use to eat. We already had the sacrament of baptism, and then I can't help but see in this eating a kind of sacred eating. Now, it may be a stretch to then force in the Eucharist here, but they're giving these precious implements: spoon, fork, and knife. In the story Persephorus, which I referenced just a moment ago, you have 3 goddesses, and one of the goddesses is offended because when she sits down to eat, her knife isn't there. Now, in the story, her knife just fell under the table, but as Greco-Roman gods and goddesses are wont to do, she doesn't bother to look under there. She immediately takes offense, and that's where the curse comes in that story. So that element is carried over here into Perrault's element. By the time you get to the more modern telling and the Disney telling, this element of eating is gone. By the way, by the time you get to the Disney telling, a lot of this other Christian element is missing. And I don't think that's a good thing. Not only because I'm a Christian, but because it represents a break in the tradition and the continuity of the way stories are told. So this story is older, began as in Persephorus, and it may have earlier roots, but began as a story which freely incorporated heavy pagan elements with the goddesses, and there's actually elements in that story which Christians would find unsavory, related to the prince and the princess, and she's actually impregnated in her sleep. But there's also Christian elements or pre-Christian elements in that story. That story is actually tied to the Arthurian cycles, the Lancelot and Grail cycle, because the child born to the prince and princess in that story is a son who is an ancestor of King Ban, who then is the father of Lancelot. So it's tied into there. So it's preparing the way for Christianity in the British Isles. So that story takes place in the British Isles. Now here, though, you have the Christian element. Now it's not overly heavy, but it's here. So these fairies are gifted with these very fine gifts, and then you have the the troubled element here, the bad element enters in here. But just as all were sitting down to table, an aged fairy was seen to enter, whom no one had thought to invite. The reason being that for more than 50 years she had never quitted the tower in which she lived, and people had supposed her to be dead or bewitched. So here enters the oldest of the fairies. She was not invited because people thought she was dead. So in this story, fairies can die, or she herself had been bewitched. It turns out she's something of a witch herself, and it's interesting here that they thought that she had perhaps she had never quitted the tower in which she lived, and eventually she'll curse the princess here to die, but through the intercession of another of the fairies, she only sleeps, and she sleeps in her tower for 100 years. So there's that connection there. And this comes back into play here, the tower and the witch, or the the bad thing in the tower. Now that by the king's orders, a place was laid for her, but it was impossible to give her a golden casket like the others, for only 7 had been made for the 7 fairies. So the king meant no offense. There's nowhere to sit. She's given a seat, but there's no casket for her. By the way, casket there, what do we often think of when we think of casket? We think of what we're laid in, a coffin when we die. So here you already have the element of death has entered in with the eating, with the christening, with the feast that is given for the princess. You already have the element of death, a golden casket. The old creature believed that she was intentionally slated, just like Venus in the story, Persephone. Venus, maybe it's not Venus, but one of the goddesses believes she's slighted. And this old fairy here mutters threats between her teeth. So she's cursing silently. She was overheard by one of the young fairies who was seated nearby, the latter guessing that some mischievous gift might be bestowed upon little princess. So this fairy has some kind of foreknowledge. She hears her and guesses what's going to happen, hid behind the tapestry, etc. So she's ready to counteract whatever the evil old fairy might do. So here you have the childless king and queen. They're finally given a child, the princess. The princess is baptized, and she's visited by these 7 fairies that are going to bless her. So you have this interplay of already of death and life. Baptism itself is a profound symbol of death and life. When you're baptized, as it says in Scripture, you die with Christ. You're crucified, you're buried. You could say you descend with him into hell, you descend with him into the grave, and you rise again with Christ into new life. So you participate with Christ in his passion by going into the water, by the threefold baptism in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. You participating with that. Here we have this image already again of life and death, of the old and the young, and the old is evil. So in this oldest of the fairies, not one of the 7, represents the old evil, or that from which we're trying to escape. The reason that we're baptized is to escape from the clutches of the old evil. Presently, the fairies began to bestow their gifts upon the princess. The youngest ordained that she should be the most beautiful person in the world. The next, that she should have the temper of an angel. The third, that she should do everything with wonderful grace. The fourth, that she should dance to perfection. The fifth, that she should sing like a nightingale. And the sixth, that she should play every kind of music with the utmost skill. I referenced before, and I'll include the link. Hopefully I can find it again. A version that's free that we can all look at, of the article the paper from Carolyn Fay, Sleeping Beauty Must Die. And she points out in this paper that in these 7 gifts, there's a progression. So the first says this child will be the most beautiful person in the world. And the next, that she should be like an angel. Well, the angels are the most beautiful. Third, she should do everything with wonderful grace. Well, angels are full of God's grace. The fourth, that she should dance to perfection. So dancing here, grace is associated with dancing. And now the dancing leads to the singing like a nightingale. And the sixth is she should play every kind of music with the utmost skill. And it comes to fruition there. Again, you have these 7 gifts which follow a logical progression here, which build upon each building upon the last to create this most beautiful of all women. Then the story says it was now the turn of the aged fairy. Shaking her head in token of spite rather than infirmity, she declared that the princess should prick her hand with a spindle and die of it. A shudder ran through the company at this terrible gift. All eyes were filled with tears. But at this moment, the young fairy stepped forth and says, paraphrasing, I can't undo what the old fairy has done, but now I will say that instead, because I've saved my 7th gift, so the 6th was that she should play every kind of music with skill. I've saved my gift, so I declare that instead of dying, she shall merely fall into a profound slumber that will last 100 years. So again, like in biblical language, when you see something like 100, 1,000, it's a long time. So she's going to die. She's going to sleep for a long time. Excuse me, she won't die. But sleeping for 100 years is a kind of death. But it's not completely given over to the old fairy. It's not completely given over to death. So a couple things there. Speaking earlier of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, if you read the gifts of the Holy Spirit as it's found in the prophet Isaiah, the 7th of these gifts is the fear of the Lord. Placing my own thoughts into this, excuse me, what is the antidote to death? And the scripture says the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. What is the antidote to death? It is to fear God. The 7th gift is the fear of the Lord, which will overcome the evil one. Here's an interesting thing as well. The king, in an attempt to avert the unhappy doom pronounced by the old fairy, at once published an edict forbidding all persons under pain of death to use a spinning wheel or to keep a spindle in the house. So the king now is doing what we would call the masculine kind of thing. I'm going to be proactive, he's saying, and I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of all the spinning wheels. In fact, in the earlier I referenced the Disney book Sleeping Beauty from 1974. There's a page where there's a great bonfire of all the spinning wheels. In fact, let me get that. This one here, and find this page here. Because I thought this was interesting as we're going through this. No particular hurry, but I thought this was very interesting. I can find the page. By the way, my daughter was supposed to return this. Forgot to. So here's a page. You can see the bonfire of all the spinning wheels. When I saw this picture again, I was I couldn't help but think of the this is a giant bonfire, and there's words coming from within it. This reminded me of like a theophany of God, like on Sinai. And with that in mind, and let's go back to the story here. But with that in mind, of Sinai in mind, the king is attempting to avert the unhappy doom, and this is a proper use of the word doom as something related to fate, to destiny. He's going to destroy all the spinning wheels. In that way, it's akin to the covenant of Sinai, which was good, but it didn't undo the old curse. It pushed it back, so to speak. It tried to keep it at bay. In the theophany of God on Sinai, in which the people were afraid to approach the holy mountain, in which they heard thunder and saw lightning, and God, they were afraid to even have God speak to them. So they said, Moses, you talk to him. And
this is the first step toward what would eventually conquer death, but this was not in itself enough. This is what we Christians call the Old Covenant, or the Mosaic Covenant. In a sense, the Mosaic Covenant is like, here's what you're going to do until the Christ comes. You're going to collect all the spinning wheels, or all your sins, and you're going to burn them up. This is like a Holocaust offered to God, with the bulls and etc. They would offer a Holocaust to God in the tabernacle and then in the temple. You're going to push this down the road until the one comes who can undo this curse. Um, so again, there that is. I thought that was interesting. the king the king knows, or has a sense, that this isn't going to work, but he's doing something out of love of his daughter, but he's trying to burn all the spinning wheels, um, in an attempt to avert the unhappy fate of his daughter of beauty, this who eventually becomes the Sleeping Beauty. Of course, it doesn't work. So at the end of 15 or 16 years, so this princess is entering into the flower of womanhood. She goes to the top of the tower, comes across an old serving woman alone with her distaff spinning. This good woman had never heard of the king's proclamation, so she's not a wicked old woman. She's just an old woman who had no idea. But the point is, there's always going to be a spinning wheel somewhere. You can't burn them all. The key is to defeat the old fairy. The key is to defeat the curse of death. You can't burn all the spinning wheels. Before I go on there, again, relate it back to the fates. So in the Persephorist, you had these goddesses. In the modern telling of Sleeping Beauty, you can see here on the cover, you have the three fairies. So this is related to the fates. I didn't know this until I looked into this. The word fairy, it looks like probably the etymology of fairy probably goes back to the Latin word for the fates, the fata. So the fates, if you're not aware, are these three goddesses. And the theme, or the trope of three goddesses or three fates, is found throughout polytheistic Europe, and seems to be common in all of Proto-Indo-European culture. By the way, I referenced before at the very beginning of this video about Jack and the Beanstalk. Jack and the Beanstalk is an ancient Proto-Indo-European story that's been told, maybe not in its form that we're aware of, but in a form very similar to it, for a very, very long time. And so has some of these other ones. This is Proto-Indo-European culture, so it's coming into Europe. So you have these three goddesses. In Greek, these are called the Moirai. These goddesses are named Lachesis, Atropos, and Croto. In Latin, they're called the Parcae, and were named Nona, Decima, and Morta. And then I was looking into this. It was very interesting that the symbols, and I kind of knew this from before, but I didn't put two and two together until I was looking into this. The symbols associated with the fates, one of the symbols associated with the fates is the spindle. So Clotho is the one who spun the thread of life from her distaff onto her spindle. Atropos cut the thread of life and chose the manner of a person's death. So Atropos is the one in the Greek stories. She's known as the inflexible one. So she is related to death. According to Hesiod's Theogony, so Hesiod, the ancient Greek poet, according to his Theogony, the Moirai were the daughters of Erebus, which is darkness, and Nyx, which is night. And Atropos was also known as Aisa, or perhaps Aisa is the embodiment of all three, because Aisa means destiny or fate. It also means a portion or a morsel, here again, relating to your portion in life, but also to morsel,
to eating. So this evil one could be the embodiment of all the fates. So as I wrote here, it becomes apparent then that the three fairy godmothers are the fates or something like them, and that the evil fairy holds something of the power of all three. She could then be Isa, or all three together. She's destiny together. So in the modern telling, you have three fairies. In Persephone, you have three goddesses. But the common theme that's kept throughout the story is this spinning wheel, or this spindle, and this is associated with fate. And what is the story here? The princess cannot escape her fate. Okay, the father, the king, tried to burn all of these spinning wheels, but eventually she found one. She says to the old woman, "What are you doing, my good woman?" And she says, "I am spinning, my pretty child," not knowing who she was. So this old woman, we're not told that she's anything other than an old serving woman, but she doesn't know this princess from Adam, as we say, meaning when you come face to face with your fate, it doesn't matter if you're an old serving woman or you're a princess. You're going to meet your fate, so to speak. You're going to face death. Oh, what fun, rejoined the princess. How do you do it? Let me try and see if I can do it equally well. Story says here, partly because she was too hasty, partly because she was a little heedless, but also because the fairy decree had ordained it. No sooner had she seized the spindle than she pricked her hand and fell down in a swoon. So this is interesting because it seems to say here in the story that she meets her fate partly because it was ordained by a preternatural power, by this evil fairy, or you could say by one of the fates, but partly because she's a little hasty and heedless herself. So the important lesson there is we have free will, and what we do also matters. So her own actions had a part to play. She approached it with haste, heedless, pricks her finger, and then she's down. In great alarm, the good dame cried out for help. So again, the old servant woman is a good woman. She cries out for help. So immediately, story says, people came running from every quarter to the princess. They threw water on her face, chafed her with their hands, and rubbed her temples with the royal essence of Hungary, but nothing would restore her. So they're trying to revive her. This royal essence of Hungary, this seems to be, from what I saw, sometimes called the Queen's water. It can be used as a perfume or as a kind of cure-all, vinegar-based thing. I saw other places where it may have contained alcohol, but it's basically a kind of medicine. Nothing worked. Okay, so there's no power in these things. There's no power in this water. There's no power in this laying on of hands, and there's no power in this oil or this essence to restore her. So these are not baptism, laying on of hands, or the oil of confirmation, or anything to do with the sacramental power. These things don't help her. Okay, she's met her fate, so to speak. Then the king, who had been brought upstairs by the commotion, remembered the fairy prophecy, feeling certain that what had happened was inevitable. And so even though he knows it's inevitable, earlier he tried to burn all the spinning wheels, but he knew it was inevitable. Since the fairies had decreed it, he gave the orders that the princess should be placed in the finest apartment in the palace upon a bed embroidered in gold and silver. You would have thought her an angel, so fair was she to behold. The trance had not taken away the lovely color of her complexion. Her cheeks were delicately flushed, her lips like coral, her eyes indeed were closed, but her gentle breathing could be heard, and it was therefore plain that she was not dead. The king commanded that she should be left to sleep in peace until the hour of her awakening should come. When the accident happened to the princess, the good fairy who had saved her life by condemning her to sleep for 100 years. So this is interesting. The fairy, the seventh of the fairies that had saved her life, also in a way condemned her. This 100-year sleep is not
it is a kind of condemnation, but it's a condemnation that saves her. In this way, we see how the sleep, the metonymy here, where one of the attributes of death is you appear to be sleeping. It says in the gospel, when Jesus came in to raise the little girl, she's not dead, she's only sleeping. And he says to her, Talitha kume, little girl, get up. Death is often described as sleep. So in this sense, she's not dead for good. She's only sleeping. And then we see, skip through that, the fairy, this is interesting. This fairy is 12,000 leagues away in this kingdom of Matakan. I might be wrong here, but I think that's 36,000 miles away. So again, we're not dealing with what we would call the real world. We're dealing with a fairy tale world. We're dealing with extraordinary powers. She's warned by a little dwarf who had a pair of 7-league boots. So this dwarf gets there with these 7-league boots. Something like this happens at the end of the story, where someone gets there just in time from far away. Again, use of the number 7, use of the number 12. These boots enable one to cover 7 leagues at a single step. So 12,000 divided by 7, I don't have it in front of me, but that's how many steps this dwarf had to take. And she set off at once. She has a chariot of fire drawn by dragons was seen approaching. So in the Disney telling, the evil fairy actually turns into a dragon. That's the only time you see a dragon. In this one, the fairy has control over dragons. So the dragon and the dragons in this story actually are helpful. Again, you see that there's no enmity between Christianity and the natural pagan religions, at least what is good of it. And in this story, it's good. In Persephorist, not as good. And definitely vengeful, and definitely sexual, and definitely pre-Christian. This one, these preternatural elements of fairies and dragons and dwarves with 7-league boots, they are now in a Christian context, and they serve the good. So she's there in an hour, which, again, unless I'm mistaken, means she traveled 36,000 miles per hour to get there. What does she do? She uses her wand, goes through and puts the whole castle, everybody but the king and queen, including the animals. It even says here the meat that was burning on the fire, it's put to sleep. Even the little dog, big mastiffs in the courtyard, and little Puff, the pet dog of the princess, they're all put into this 100-year sleep. Why? So that when the princess wakes up, they'll be there too, because she's going to have need of them. As I said earlier, referencing the Walt Disney one, I couldn't help but think, when you have all these people placed in this sleep, what is sleep like? Talked about the metonymy. Sleep is like unto death. They're placed in this death, but they're not annihilated. They're placed in death. This is likened to the righteous of old, who were waiting for the coming of Christ in Sheol, waiting for them. When you're asleep, you're not aware of anybody else. The world that exists, the dream world, is completely you. So there's a separation there. The same way, I believe those who were waiting for Christ were experiencing, we can't know this for sure, but I can imagine experiencing a kind of profound loneliness as well. If you look at the depiction of Hades in Greek mythology, etc., it's extremely gloomy. There's an extreme loneliness. So you are isolated, you're alone, you're in a state of being preserved. So in this instance, they're being preserved until the coming of the prince, who will wake up the princess. So they're all put to sleep. The king and queen kissed their dear child without waking her. That's kind of funny, because
it's a prince that will awake her. So the king and queen, as I said again in the Disney story, when my daughter was reading it to me and showing me this, the king and queen, immediately I thought of Adam and Eve, and um, maybe I got it on the brain, but Adam and Eve are not able to help their children. Okay, in the newer story, um, she's awoken by the kiss of the prince. So the king and queen kiss the child, but she's not going to wake up. So the way it's worded here is kind of funny. It's like, oh, we don't want to wake her. We're going to give her a little kiss. But the point is, they have no power to wake her. Then they leave the castle. Proclamations were issued forbidding any to approach it. So in this story, there's a great forest grows up around with brambles and thorns. This is meant to protect her. In the new story, the evil fairy raises up these thorny roses and all these brambles to prevent the prince from coming to her. In this one, it's to protect the princess. So that's the scene. Then you move on to 100 years past. There's another family on the throne. And the king's son, so here's the prince. He's out hunting, and he happens to go that way. He sees in the distance some towers in the midst of a large and dense forest. He asks what they were. His attendants have no idea, but they tell him some stories that they've heard. Some said there was an old castle haunted by ghosts, others that all the witches of the neighborhood held their revels there. The favorite tale was that in the castle lived an ogre who carried thither all the children whom he could catch. There he devoured them at his leisure, and since he was the only person who could force the passage through the wood, nobody had been able to pursue him. This is very interesting. So the talk of the people in the area is that this castle holds something evil, and the favorite story is that there's an ogre who lives there, and we know from these fairy tales, ogres eat children. And according to the story, the ogre was the only one who could pass. This is interesting because you see later in the story, it's revealed that the prince's mother is an ogress. She's an ogre. She's an ogress, and she wants to eat children. We get to that. And according to the tale of the peasants here, the people here, only the ogre could pass, when in actuality it was the son of the ogress who was the only one who could pass through, the prince himself. He knows this, by the way, about his mother. So it's interesting that the people know there's an ogre around. They think it's in that castle. The ogre is actually in the royal castle, and she's the wife of the king and the mother of the prince. While the prince was wondering what to believe, an old peasant took up the tale. Your Highness, said he, more than 50 years ago I heard my father say that in this castle lies a princess, the most beautiful that has ever been seen. It is her doom to sleep there for 100 years and then to be awakened by a king's son for whose coming she waits. The story fired the young prince. He jumped immediately to the conclusion that it was for him to see so gay an adventure through, and impelled alike by the wish for love and glory, he resolved to set about it on the spot. So he says, I'm the one. I'm the brave prince. It's for me to do it. Hardly had he taken a step towards the wood when the tall trees, the brambles, and the thorns separated of themselves and made a path for them. He turned in the direction of the castle and spied it at the end of a long avenue. So he just takes a step and it separates for him. And in the story of the peasants, it was the ogre was the only one who could pass. In reality, it's the son of the ogress, the one who is prophesied, we could say, to come, is the one for whom the forest parts. Then he comes to this castle. This avenue he entered and was surprised to notice that the trees closed up again as soon as he passed, so that none of his retinue could follow him. The story says, a young and gallant prince is always brave, however, so he continued on his way and presently reached a large forecourt. A young and gallant prince is always brave. The sight that now met his eyes was enough to fill him with fear. It seemed that dreadful death was all around him. The recumbent figures of men and animals had the appearance of being lifeless, until he perceived by their pimply noses and ruddy faces that they merely slept. In fact, he sees that some of them were drinking wine when they fell asleep. Again, this is very reminiscent of the stories, the ancient myths about the place of the dead or Hades. You're there, but it's as though you're dead, but you're sleeping. You may eat and drink in hell, but it's not. There's no pleasure in it. You become frozen in hell. What's the story? I believe it's Theseus was sat down in hell and was stuck there until he was rescued by Heracles. So he goes into the courtyard. He sees the guards there. They're snoring. The ladies, the this and the that. He comes upon the princess, who seems to be about 15 or 16 years old, whose radiant beauty had an almost unearthly luster. Trembling in his admiration, he drew near and went on his knees beside her. At the same moment, the hour of disenchantment having come, the princess awoke and bestowed upon him a look more tender than a first glance might seem to warrant. "Is it you, dear prince?" she said. "You have been long in coming." So she'd been waiting for a prince for a long time. In this story, he doesn't even kiss her. He kneels to her, and she wakes up. So it's definitely different. Different than the newer telling where there's the kiss, but way different than the telling in Persephorus where there's actually a sexual encounter that is um, not consensual and actually impregnates the princess in that story. So this is a very chaste meeting, a very Christian meeting in a very fairy tale preternatural environment. So this prince is indeed Christ-like. He's brave. He is alone the one who can really pass through the forest, the thorns, and the brambles. He's the one who can come and wake up the sleepers. So in that way, again, he is a Christ figure. He is a little Christ, and he comes and kneels beside his soon-to-be bride, and she wakes up. She says, "Is it you, dear prince? You have been long in coming." She has been waiting for him for this long period of 100 years. Charmed by these words, and especially by the manner in which they were said, the prince was so delightful, gratified, he does not express his words. So, as the story says, the less there is of words, the more there is of eloquence and love. So it's a love that is true right off the bat. It's not expressed so much in words as it is in the exchange of feelings, in the exchange of mutual glances, in the love of one waiting for the lover to come. This draws to mind in the Canticle of Canticles, the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, the lover and the beloved. Not a lot of words exchanged, but a lot of loving action and a lot of waiting. Her embarrassment was less than his. Well, she's 116 years old, so she's got a little bit on in there. This is interesting too. Although the story says nothing about it, the good fairy, it's believed the good fairy had beguiled her long slumber with pleasant dreams. It's just assumed. The story says nothing about it, so that even the narrator doesn't know. There's a key there. So sleep is so much like death that only the sleeper knows what his or her dreams are. Not even the narrator is privy to that, but it's assumed that this good fairy has given pleasant dreams in the princess's sleep. To be brief, after 4 hours of talking, they had not succeeded in uttering one half of the things they had to say to each other. Now the whole palace had awakened with the princess. That's a sign there of, in the story, of true love. These two are destined for each other, you could say. After 4 hours, they had not shared half of what they had to say to each other. The whole palace was awakened. This is kind of funny. Everyone went about his business. So they just wake up. We're going to, got things to do. I got to do what I got to do. And since they were not all in love, they begin presently to feel mortally hungry. So not everybody is a prince or princess. Not everybody can be in love all the time. So we're actually hungry down here. You guys are talking for 4 hours, looking into each other's eyes. That's great for you. But as the lady in waiting does here, she's suffering like the rest. She loses her patience and calls out to the princess, "Supper is served." Again, magic spells and heroic princes notwithstanding, there's some empty stomachs there. They've been waiting 100 years to eat, and we're not going to wait any longer. We're going to eat. The prince was already fully dressed and in most magnificent style. As he helped her to rise, the prince refrained from telling her that her clothes were out. So basically, her clothes are out of style. The clothes of his grandma. and in truth, they in no way detracted from her beauty. So even though she's wearing outdated clothing, she's from another era, so to speak. Her beauty overcomes that. They passed into an apartment hung with mirrors. Music is playing, fiddles, oboes, and they played well considering that they had not played for just upon 100 years. So even after 100 years, they're still doing pretty good. That's muscle memory. So if you're learning a musical instrument or you're learning how to do something, you want to keep doing it. So that way, if you get frozen in time for 100 years, you can pick right up where you left off. You play the oboe, you play the fiddle, whatever you do your practice, get your practice in. That way, when you wake up from your 100-year sleep, you hit the elbow like you didn't miss a day. A little later, when supper was over, the chaplain married them in the castle chapel. There's no waiting around here. Again, they're married. Good Christian wedding. There's a chaplain there. I guess he had been frozen. No, not frozen, but asleep. And he marries them. And it's attended by courtiers in waiting. So it's a Christian wedding. Chaplain. There's witnesses. Everything's lined up there. There's no problem there. In the sacramental register with their wedding. They slept but little, however. So this is a discreet way of saying what is said overtly in Persephorist. So again, they're meeting in the marital embrace. The princess indeed had not much need of sleep, and as soon as morning came, the prince took his leave of her. I guess not. She just slept for 100 years, so she's good on that end. So he goes back to the city, tells his father, who was anxious that he had been hunting, so he lies. Why is he lying, though? So you get there, he says he had spent the night with a charcoal burner who gave him black bread and cheese. So his royal father, who it turns out had married an ogress because she was wealthy, he's a schmuck, he believes it. But the mother of the ogress is cunning. So her nose is moving, so to speak. She knows something's wrong here. That's why he lies to her. She felt certain that he was having a love affair. Well, he's going hunting all the time, and he's gone 2 or 3 nights at a time. So he's doing something. 2 years passed since the marriage of the prince and princess. During that time, they had 2 children. The first, a daughter, was called Dawn. Which, by the way, as we get in the Disney movies, unless the princess's name Aurora. That's Dawn, Aurora, and the boy is named Day or Jour. The dawn leads to the day because he seems even more beautiful than his sister. As Carolyn Faye points out in her paper, the masculine, the boy child, even though he's younger than the girl, he's going to inherit the crown one day. Dawn leads to day, so you have this progression, and this is kind of the antithesis. By the way, we're talking about the fates, as I have written down here. Yeah, we go back to Hesiod and his Theogony, talking about the fates. These are the daughters of Erebus and Nyx, or darkness and night. So you have the antidote to darkness and night is dawn and day. Okay, so it's kind of a these children, Dawn and Day, are kind of a cry of victory against darkness and night, and they're the new Adam and the new Eve, because a new dawn has come and a new day is here, freed from the curse that was in place up until that time. Many a time the queen told her son that he ought to settle down in life. We'll find out why. She tried in this way to make him confide in her, but he didn't trust her. I wonder why. Because despite his affection, so he's a good son, he has affection for his mother, but she comes from a race of ogres, and the king had only married her for her wealth. So he can't fully trust his mother because she's a monster. She's an ogre. And what do ogres do? Ogres eat little children. So again, now we have a new villain, a new villainess. The old fairy's gone, and kind of taking her place is this ogress, wicked queen. So you had the fairy before that was old and vengeful. Her spell was broken, counteracted. That's over. Now introduce
another another evil feminine element is this ogress. It was whispered at court that she had ogreish instincts, and when little children were near her, she had the greatest difficulty in the world to keep herself from pouncing on them. So she just can't wait to eat little kids. Um, and that's what she's about that, and that's what her son knows about it. And it says here, as Perrault writes, no wonder the prince was reluctant to say a word. I guess so. Your mother wants to eat your children. After 2 years, the king died, and the prince found himself on the throne. He made a public announcement of his marriage and went in state to fetch his royal consort from the castle. With her 2 children beside her, she made a triumphal entry into the capital of her husband's realm. So now she's out in the open. She's coming in with her 2 children, Dawn and Day. Here is Beauty, the most beautiful woman in the world with all these graces, is coming in to the realm. Sometime afterwards, the king declared war on his neighbor, the Emperor Cantalabute, which I believe, from what I looked up, I saw it was written down. I don't know my source, but it was pretty funny. This apparently in French, this is the equivalent of saying King Fuzzy Wuzzy, which means what? It's not really important. He's off doing something that's not important. Don't worry about it. Okay. What's happening at home here is the real story. I think you could also say that the king ought to have been, no doubt, ought to have been with his wife and children, since he knows the queen mother is an ogress and eats children. Instead, he's off playing war with King Fuzzy Wuzzy. So he's begun to lose some of what he had before, not acting in the wisest sense. He expected to be away at the war for the whole of the summer, and as soon as he was gone, the queen mother sent her daughter-in-law and the 2 children to a country mansion in the forest. The better to eat you where you're in the woods by yourself. So I'm the queen mother. Get ye to the country mansion, because now this she did, that she might be able to more easily gratify her horrible longing. So you can imagine the people woke up from 100 years. I mean, they're hungry. This ogress is hungry all the time. She has these horrible longings to eat children, to eat the innocent. So she is a monster. She is a devil. So even after baptism, even after the rising from the dead to new life in Christ, even after being rescued, now you still have to deal with your concupiscible nature. You still have to deal with concupiscence. You still have to deal with that ogre that has horrible longings to consume what is good. That is herself a kind of daughter of Erebus. That is herself a thing from hell, a hellish thing. So the story, it gets very nightmarish here. So the first part of the Beauty in the Wood is the Sleeping Beauty story that we're all familiar with. But Sleeping Beauty ceases to be Sleeping Beauty when she wakes up. Now we're going here, life continues. Now we move to the story of the ogress queen mother, the awakened Beauty and her children, Dawn and Day, who are alone in the country mansion. This is turning very quickly into kind of a horror story, a horror movie. They're here alone with this thing. Now we don't know. We're not privy to information of whether or not the Beauty, the Sleeping Beauty, the now queen, and her children, whether or not they knew this, whether or not she knew this information about her mother-in-law, that she was an ogress. I gotta believe she didn't. That might be something you might want to share with your wife. Hey, by the way, my mom's an ogress, and she really wants to eat children, so steer clear. Anyway, they're there alone in the country mansion. A few days later, she went there and in the evening summoned the chief steward. This chief steward motif, by the way, is in other stories. If you're familiar with, a lot of us are familiar with, I just forgot the story, Snow White and the 7 dwarves. Look at the 7 there then. And Snow White, again, there's a steward, there's a huntsman, there's this go-between. So now you have the steward of the house.
So she comes right out front to the steward here. For my dinner tomorrow, she says to him, I will eat little Dawn. Oh, madam, exclaimed the steward. Yeah, oh, madam, I don't know about that. That is my will, said the queen, and she spoke in the tones of an ogre who longs for raw meat. You're going to bring something to that ogre, or you're going to get it. Oh, madam's right. And then, even more disturbing, this is kind of like a Hannibal Lecter line here. You will serve her with piquant sauce. I saw in other translations of the story that this is called sauce Robert. It's a certain kind of French sauce that you serve, especially with pork, but it can also be served chicken or beef. You're going to serve her with this piquant. So the ogress knows this is the kind of sauce I like with little kid meat. I want this piquant sauce. You will kill her, and I want this sauce. Very particular. Okay, this is horrific. Sounds a little funny that she's ordering, but if you think about it, it's her own granddaughter, and she wants to eat her with this certain sauce. Again, this goes back to even after the lifting of the curse, even after baptism, even after the great story that had already taken place, you still have to deal with this ogress. You still have to deal with your passions, with your violent passions, with your lust for other people's flesh, whether that be in an immoral sexual way or whether that be in a violent way. It is a kind of consuming of the other, the selfishness, and you want what you want in the way you want it. It's not just that I want this, I'm dwelling on it, and I want this thing that I should never have. This is a sin against God and a sin against nature. It's cannibalism of your own grandchild. But I want her with piquant sauce. I want her with sauce Robert. You will serve her up to me, and she will be raw. She describes exactly how she wants this done. The poor man, seeing plainly that it was useless to trifle with an ogress, took his big knife, so he's going to follow through with it, because it's useless to trifle with an ogress. You can't speak reason to a monster. You cannot speak reason to a monster. You either have to kill the monster, flee from the monster, or somehow imprison the monster. She was, speaking of Dawn, at that time 4 years old, and she came up running with a smile to greet the chief steward. She flings her arms around his neck and coaxing her to give her some sweets. This is such a sweet encounter. She's so innocent and sweet, this Dawn, that he bursts into tears and he drops the knife. He can't do it. He can't go through with what the ogress wants him to do. So he goes into the yard and he tries to fool her. Here we get the substitution. Instead of Dawn, now you will have a lamb. I'm going to slaughter the lamb and give it to you. And again, if we go back to that motif, this ancient motif of we owe God, the monsters are coming for us because we've disobeyed God, and we owe a death. But God will give us a lamb in place. He will give us a sacrifice in place, a substitutionary sacrifice in place. So he kills the lamb instead and serves it to her, and his sauce is so slamming that she declares she's never eaten anything so good. At the same time, the steward carried little Dawn to his wife, and she hid her away, just like little Moses is hidden away. Little John the Baptist was hidden away at one point. Little Jesus was hidden away at one point. In fact, if you go to the Holy Land, into Judea there, into the hill country, if you go to what is historically considered to be the home of Zechariah and Elizabeth, there's a rock that's still there. And according to tradition, it was behind that rock that Elizabeth hid the little John the Baptist. Why? Because he was going to be killed by Herod as well. We forget about that. Herod's killing all the boy children under a certain age. Well, John the Baptist fell into that category as well. So this motif is there throughout, of the innocent little child being hidden away from the monster.
Okay, moving on. So 8 days pass. And I think we see the number 8 here. And this is reminiscent of the eighth fairy. The wicked old fairy was the eighth one. And here we have the 8 days later. She summons the steward and says, "For my supper, I will eat little Day." Now she's moving up or down, whichever way you want. She's going to eat her little grandson, Day. So in her mind, I've already eaten dawn. Now I'm going to eat the day. Well, there's going to be no light left. The steward made no answer, being determined to trick her as he had done previously. He went in search of little Day, found the little son playing with a tiny foil, making brave passes, though he was only 3. Had a big monkey. He's fighting with this monkey. He's a brave little boy. He carries him off to his wife, who hides him away as well, and in place of Day, he serves the ogress a young kid. So a baby, a little goat, a young kid, so tender that she found it surpassingly delicious. So a lamb was the substitute for dawn. A kid is the substitute for Day, and she's full. So far, so good, as it says right here. But there came an evening when this evil queen again addressed the steward. The problem with the monster is the problem with the ogre. The ogress is you can't get by with feeding it. It's never enough. Same thing with your passions. It's never enough. Your concupiscence is never enough. You can't say, "Oh, I'll give into this and then I'll avoid something else." You can't. You have to flee from sin as from the plague, says St. John Climacus. Free from sin as from the plague. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. But you can't give in. You can't say, as an antidote to this big grave sin, I'm going to do this lesser sin. And that is one of the poisonous mindsets that infects modernity. This idea that, well, this thing's a big bad thing. So instead of engaging in that, which is sinful, I'm going to engage in this little sin, this little duplicity, this little passion. The Bible talks about the little foxes who break in and eat the grapes. I'm going to engage in this little one. The problem is all you're doing is firing up the hunger of the evil, firing up your passions. You can't engage in any of it because eventually the ogress, the evil queen, wants more. And she says, "I have a mind to eat the queen with the same sauce as you served with her children." The sauce was a hit. Now I want the queen. Moving past eating little children, now I'm going to eat my son's wife. So Beauty had escaped the curse of the eighth fairy, had been saved by her Prince Charming, and now only to fall victim to her mother-in-law, who's an ogress who wants to eat her with a sauce, who she's thinking had already been served with her own grandchildren. This time, the poor steward despaired of being able to practice another deception. I just can't do it. Why? Because the young queen is 20, but she's actually 120. And although her skin is white and beautiful and has become a little tough, and I'll get to this at the end here. It's a little funny. Even though she's young, even though she's 20, she's really 120. And even though the skin looks white and beautiful, it's a little tough. Get to that at the end. There's a kind of a funny moral to the story that seems kind of out of place. What animal could he possibly find that would correspond to her? Kind of saying there, even though she's 20, that she's really 120. She's a little past her prime. And it's good for her she's already married and had children. Because if she hadn't gotten married yet and had children, she's a little past her prime. We'll get to that in the moral of the story. Don't wait around. Because even though your skin might look white and beautiful, what's going on the inside, what's going on in beneath the surface, you're getting tough. You're less likely to have children. You're less likely to pass for something young, even though you might think you look young. You're getting a little old there. So he's made up his mind that he would save his own life. So he's saying, "I can't do this anymore. If I don't kill the queen and serve her in that sauce Robert to the ogress, she's going to kill me. She's going to kill my wife. And then she's probably going to discover, I'm reading into it here, and she's going to discover the children anyway. So I just got to do this." And probably thinking, we'll raise the children ourselves. So he's determined he's going to commit this grave sin and kill Beauty.
So he goads himself into a rage. He draws his knife and enters the young queen's chamber. How often do we amp ourselves up to do a great sin? You can feel yourself boiling. Uh, I want to do this thing, or I think I need to do it, but I can't quite make myself do it. So I got to work myself up, work myself up, work myself up. I have to manufacture rage, manufacture fuel to commit this sin. Don't do that. If you feel yourself wanting to do something wrong, um, don't begin that process of goading yourself into a rage to commit, in this case, murder. But a reluctance to give her no moment of grace made him repeat respectfully the command which he had received from the Queen Mother. So what's that mean? He comes in and he says, Your Highness, I'm here on order of the Queen Mother to kill you so I can serve you to her. I don't know if maybe he didn't include that eating part, but he says, I'm here to kill you. And to his great surprise, she says, do it. And she bares her neck. Why? Why would she want this? Well, because she doesn't know where her children are. She thinks her children are gone. She says, do this and I'm going to see my children again. So again, we get to hear flirting. Beauty here is again flirting with death. This time, though, there's no waking up after 100 years. If he cuts your throat, you're gone. And little does she know, she wouldn't see her children anyway. So again, she's giving into a kind of despair. But thanks be to God, the chief steward knows the truth because he had saved the children. So he's overcome by compassion. So this guy is a good guy. And thank God he's here because the king's off fighting King Fuzzy Wuzzy instead of taking care of his wife and children. So in that way, I said before, he's a Christ figure. In that way, he's not. So again, as we look at these stories, we're looking at Sleeping Beauty. As we look at other ones, when you read these stories, you have types, you have anti-types, you have foreshadowings, you have metaphors, you have you have symbols, but they're never exactly precise. Okay, so someone can be a hero, can be a Christ, can be a good knight, something one scene and the next one it's not so hot. That's kind of how it works. That's how human nature works, because even the most valiant prince is a kind of Christ, but just a type. Okay, just a shadow of the true king. But thank God, again, this steward is an upright man, so he can't even do it. Even though he's afraid for his own life, he can't kill the queen. He says, no, madam, you shall not die, but you shall certainly see your children again. That will be in my quarters where I've hidden them. So good news, I'm not going to slit your throat. And I know where your kids are. They're with me. So I'm assuming he has all of his clearances to be around children. He's done the online training. He's filled out the state police report. And he's done the FBI background check. And he's got his clearance, him and his wife, or else he could get in big trouble for being around children without his clearances. But he has them hidden in his room. And he says, I shall make the queen eat a young hind in place of you and thus trick her once more. So I think a young hind, it's out in the wild, it's jumping around. Maybe it'll approximate to your flesh. It's getting a little tough. I can trick her because I make one heck of a sauce Robert. Without more ado, he led her to his quarters, and leaving her there to embrace and weep over her children, proceeded to cook a hind with such art that the queen mother ate it for her supper with as much appetite as if it had been the young queen. So she's done gobbled up 3 animals, thinking that is her daughter-in-law and her 2 grandchildren, and she is one satisfied ogress. And right here we see the queen mother felt well satisfied with her cruel deeds and planned to tell the king on his return that savage wolves had devoured his consort and his children. So she's full of herself. She's high and mighty. She's satisfied with her cruelty. Her stomach's full of what she thinks is her human meat, the human meat of her relatives. She's a real monster. You think of Kronos eating his own children.
This idea is very ancient of the father or the mother who's witchly or evil that eats their own children, um, devours, excuse me, their own children, their own progeny. In this way, this kind of death is worse because, um, and again, I highly recommend if you're interested more, look at the paper by Carolyn Fay, because I believe that's where I read that she goes into it. Why do we eat? Why do we engage in the marital act? Why do we procreate? To have offspring. And we eat to have strength to do that. So the eating is to strengthen us, to make more of us, to be fruitful and multiply. It's not an end unto itself, to keep us alive so we can fulfill the will of God. But by eating your own progeny, by eating your own relatives, by eating your daughter or your son or your grandchildren, you're filling yourself up, but there's nothing left after you. Again, I was just reminded when I was speaking there of any of you are familiar with the Silmarillion by Tolkien. In the Silmarillion, you have the evil Lord Morgoth, but you also have this giant spider creature, Ungoliant, and she's worse, and she wants to eat everything. So to the point where she takes a run at Morgoth himself, but she eats one of the Silmarils. She poisons the trees. That's all in the Silmarillion, if you're not aware. That's in Tolkien's mythological world. But again, you have this ancient trope of the thing that eats so much that it even would eat itself. It's like the Ouroboros, the chaos, the snake swallowing itself. So this ogress queen mother represents chaos, disorder. And this is what sin is. This is what concupiscence is, that we battle even after baptism, even after Christ has died and risen again. We have to battle against this compulsion from our fallen or wounded human nature to sin to the point that we not only hurt those around us or kill those around us, but in killing the other, we kill ourselves. In killing the other, we kill ourselves. In killing our neighbors, we kill ourselves. And we eat everything. We take all the fruit from all the trees. We poison everything in our greed and our lust for everything. We take everything and we end up killing ourselves. That's what's happening here. She is the savage wolf that she was going to tell her son ate his wife and children. She has no charity for anyone, including herself. She is an outright monster. It was her habit, however, and she gets even more. This story is very grisly. It's no wonder that Sleeping Beauty cuts off at this point. It's very dark. This is like it's a horror movie. Where was I at here? It was her habit, however, to prowl often about the courts and alleys of the mansion in the hope of scenting raw meat. So she's on the prowl again. She is a wild wolf. She's a ravaging monster. She's on the prowl. And one evening she heard the little boy Day crying in a basement cellar. The child was weeping because his mother had threatened to whip him for some naughtiness, and she heard at the same time the voice of Dawn begging forgiveness for her brother. I'm not sure why the queen didn't leave with her children after she found out the plot, but she's still there. They're hiding out there, I guess, just waiting for the prince to come back, who's now the king, to come back. Day in the basement cellar. This is interesting. The sun in the earth. So this is a time of darkness. As she's prowling around in the darkness, the courts and alleys of the mansion and the highways and byways, it says in the Bible, the devil is moving up and down in the earth and prowling about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he will devour. And the little boy Day, is in the basement cellar, meaning the sun is in the earth. The sun, it's dark out. And he's weeping. And Dawn is begging forgiveness for her brother. So Dawn precedes the day, and the Dawn is begging for the return of the sun. She's begging for forgiveness. But the ogress overhears this. The ogress recognized the voice of the queen and her children and was enraged to find she had been tricked. The next morning, in tones so affrighting that all trembled, she ordered a huge vat to be brought into the middle of the courtyard. This she filled with vipers and toads, with snakes and serpents of every kind, intending to cast into it the queen and her children,
and the steward with his wife and serving girl. By her command, these were brought forward with their hands tied behind their back. So she's got other people helping her. Apparently, she brings in a vat filled with these vipers, toads, snakes, serpents. These things in themselves can kill you, but they won't eat you. These are animals that are associated with darkness, with the earth, with night, also associated with witchcraft, with black magic. At this point, the Queen Mother, the ogress, has moved past uh, the aching need for cannibalism, and now she just wants revenge. Now she just wants the death in this occultic way. So this is black magic she's going to do here. She's going to place them into this vat uh, for these animals of the earth, these animals of the darkness, to kill not only the queen and their children, but the steward, his wife, and the serving girl. By her command, these are brought forward, and their hands are tied behind their back, so they're about to be sacrificed. There they were, and her minions were making ready to cast them into the vat. When into the courtyard rode the king. Oh, he must have the 7 league boots. Just in time. There's a literary device, or a lot of people complain about these, but it's known as the Deus ex machina, the God out of the machine, meaning just in the nick of time. Something supernatural intervenes, or something comes in right at the nick of time. This is the Rex ex machina. I think it's described in another place. The king just comes in right at the nick of time. It's the hand of God at the end. Literally, what story is that? If you read the Stand by Stephen King, which is wicked long, but builds up, builds up, builds up. There's about to be the firing of a nuclear weapon. Uh-oh, everything's lost. Literally, a hand comes and stops it. So Stephen King literally wrote into his story the hand of God. Here the king comes in. Nobody had expected him so soon, but he traveled post haste. He's moving with this speed, and one wonders if the seventh fairy had helped him, or maybe the dwarf with the 7 league boots. Something happened, but he's there in time. So he's regaining his chivalric status. He's back handling his business. Filled with amazement, he demanded to know what this means. I guess so. Hey, Mom, what's going on? You got my wife and children tied up, and these other people, and I see a big vat full of these nasty animals. What's going on? It's like, you already know what's going on, but it's like if you have a loved one with some kind of addiction problem or something, like, here we go again. Please don't tell me you're going to eat my wife or children, and now you're going to throw them in here. So he wants to know what this means. I think it's pretty apparent what this means, but no one dares say anything. So the presence of the king, he's finally back, the return of the king, and his presence is so awesome, so awe-inspiring. No one wants to talk. And at that moment, the ogress is enraged at what confronted her. What confronts her now? The king's back from fighting Fuzzy Wuzzy. Now he's come back. He's regained his stature. He's rode in on his charger. He's rode in on his horse, and he's confronted his mother in the presence of the king, the presence of his majesty. She's enraged at it. Okay. She can't even address him. She can't fight back. She throws herself into the vat, and she's devoured on the instant by the hideous creature she had placed into it. Again, these animals don't really eat you, but it's again, what is this symbolize? She's destroyed by her own black magic. She's destroyed by the demons that she thought she could control, and she's destroyed by her own hunger, by her own insidiousness, by her own plans for revenge. She ends up throwing herself headlong into the vat. In the presence of the king. It's much like Judas, who couldn't handle what he had done, and he hangs himself. The queen throws herself into it. And again, that symbolism of the ogress going down into the darkness of the vat. These things, vipers, toads, snakes, and serpents, often in stories, in fact, in the Bible, and if you speak with exorcists, demons are associated with vipers and toads, snakes, and serpents. They will manifest these things. They will be represented by these things. So this ogress going into the vat filled with these nasty animals, this symbolizes her casting herself headlong into hell. A fitting end for this monster. So this concludes the second part of Sleeping Beauty, the Beauty in the Wood, the part most of us probably weren't familiar with. And this is the horrific part. So as the story ends here, the king could not but be sorry because he did love his mother, but he found ample consolation in his beautiful wife and children. So, and we're going to get to the moral here. It's important for a man to be a father. Now, some men are called to priesthood or to religious life, and they're spiritual fathers, and we're all called to be spiritual fathers. But most of us are called to marriage and family, and you will find your consolation truly in your wife and children, and in nothing else in that same way. And so the king who's regained his Christ-like status finds consolation in his wife and children. And what's that? In the Holy Church. And Satan has been bound and cast into hell. The ogress queen mother has been bound and cast down. In closing, here's the moral of the story. Many a girl has waited long for a husband brave or strong, but I'm sure I never met any sort of woman yet who could wait 100 years, free from fretting, free from fears. Now our story seems to show that a century or so, late or early matters not. True love comes by fairy lot. Some old folk will even say it grows better by delay. So some old folks will say it's better to wait for marriage, or you know, the fairies will set you up with somebody. Blah, blah. Yet this good advice, I fear, helps us neither there nor here. Though philosophers may prate how much wiser 'tis to wait, maids will be a sighing still. Young blood must when young blood will. So in closing, the moral seems not to fit that. And I think what it's saying, and this has been touched on in other places, the two great enemies in the story were these two wicked feminine characters, the evil fairy and the ogress queen mother. And both of them were antisocial, and both of them sought to destroy family, were against children. And at one point we see there where the princess become queen, Beauty, is 120. She's 20 going on 120, and even though she looks white and beautiful, her skin is free from, her skin seems flawless, but she's somehow getting old. Don't delay. Don't wait for a fairy to find you a man. Don't wait for a fairy to set you up with your husband. Same token to men. Don't wait for a fairy to set you up with your wife. Your consolation is found in God, ultimately, but your consolation in this life is in your wife and children. Your consolation is in your family. Your consolation, is in spiritual fatherhood, spiritual motherhood, in protecting the innocent, in cultivating virtue. So I believe that's what that moral means. So that is the end there. That was La Belle au Bois, Dormant, Sleeping Beauty, the Beauty in the Woods, Sleeping Beauty in the Woods. That was very interesting. This went very long. If you're still here, God bless you. And I hope to do more of these. This is a long analysis type of thing. But I enjoyed looking into this. I think there's a lot to be gained from these kind of things. So hopefully we can learn something, and thank you for watching. Good night, Godspeed. Have a good day wherever you're at, and God bless.